Then my name is Joaquín Rivaya-Martínez, as Erin very well pronounced a moment ago. And I've been doing research on the indigenous peoples of the US-Mexico borderland for over 25 years now. Much of my research has had to do mainly with the Comanche, and those are the people with whom I have been in touch for decades now. So this, first of all, I'm not an archaeologist, so bear with me today. I became interested in rock art because this document I'm going to be discussing today was made available to me, and I realized that there was some potential to, maybe with the help of wiser people than myself, use it in order to interpret rock art panels in the Southern Plains and actually in the larger territory that Comanches roamed in the 19th century, including part of northern Mexico. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me know when you can see it, okay? Share here and there. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to share. Can you see it now?
No.
No.
Okay.
Oh.
Now you can, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, let me get rid of the floating commands here so they're not in the way. All right, and then, okay, minimize this. All right, so, so let me start from the beginning. Let me show you the document. Actually, before that, let me give you a little bit of background in case some of you are not aware of what was going on on the Southern Plains in the late 18th century. So the Spanish in the late 18th century had settled a small area, what we now call New Mexico and Texas, right? And Spanish settlements, the region was very thinly inhabited by people of European descent. As a matter of fact, most of the people that we now call Spaniards were people of mixed descent. And as time went by, they were increasingly more mixed with local populations, right? So even the earliest Spanish settlers who came to the so-called northern borderlands of New Spain consisted partly of indigenous people from central Mexico and also mestizos, or people of mixed descent. So these settlements of northern New Spain were rather remote. We may want to think of them in terms of clusters of settlement rather than being occupying the territory extensively. They were kind of isolated enclaves, right? And very, very remote from one another much of the time. In a region that was largely inhabited by independent Indians, including all the people that appear on this map that you are looking at now in red. So if you think of New Mexico, for instance, the only sizable settlements in New Mexico were Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and what we now know as Española, that used to be called by a different name in the past. And then in Texas, much of the Spanish settlement concentrated along the San Antonio River. Can you see my mouse moving around here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So in the 18th century, in the late 18th century, Spanish changed dramatically their policies on the borderlands as a consequence of the 7-Year War, right? In the 7-Year War, the British defeated France and Spain, and the Spanish undertook a thorough reorganization of the frontier that involved the creation of the so-called interior provinces, which was kind of a separate jurisdiction under military command. And they initiated a formal policy of trying to establish treaties with the people they called barbaros, meaning independent, non-Christianized, non-unacculturated, let's say, Indians, right? Because of the circumstances of the frontier, the military officers came to the conclusion that it would be most convenient to reach an agreement with the Comanches and continue waging war on the Apaches, because in their experience, Apaches were not as trustworthy for treaties, and they tended to think of them as more unreliable than the Comanches. So it is in this context of these changes in terms of the military and Indian policies of the Spanish along the northern frontier of what was once the Viceroyalty of New Spain, that the document was produced. So I'm going to show you the document now. Here we go. And as you can see, it consists of a larger sheet of paper that contains some Spanish text, which is basically a legend explaining the symbols on this smaller piece of paper that is kind of overimposed, right? So the document consists of a small piece of paper, roughly 11 by 20 centimeters, roughly of a rectangular shape, that contains all these signs made with ink. And then the legend, as I was telling you a moment ago, is dated July 30th, 1787, and it's signed by Anza. Anza was Juan Bautista de Anza, the then governor of New Mexico. This document should be at the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City, but it happens to be at the Library of Congress. Don't ask me how or why, but that's what it is right now. At the Library of Congress, they have it cataloged as a map. And what I'm going to argue today is that it's not exactly a map. It's rather a kind of a tally, or as I would like to put it, a report on a Comanche campaign against the Apache. So in the smaller piece of paper, this one over here, this similar signs are organized into rows and columns, and there is a capital letter, sometimes repeated, that is referenced in the attached legend to represent or to indicate what the signs mean, right? So the signs can be easily grouped in this way and interpreted thanks to the Spanish text. So what I'm going to try today is to make sense of this document following this the indications of the Spanish text, but also complementing it with other information, other evidence, including documentary evidence, but also archaeological, ethnographic, and oral interviews with Comanches and Apaches that I have conducted in the past. So let's take a closer look at the document for a second. So if we assume the orientation of the document suggested by the alphabetic characters, the bottom shows a row of 95 vertical lines, right here, that represent the Comanche warriors who participated in the campaign. The longer and the kind of thicker, most prominent line in the middle represents the leader of the campaign, whom the Spanish identify as Isampampi. Isampampi is a Comanche word that means literally wolf's head, and it's the name of a Comanche leader of the Cuchuntica division that we know through other documents. The top edge of the document here and part of the right side show 35 symbols representing the Apaches they captured, that the Spanish text identifies as prisoners of all sexes, meaning that there were both male and female captives. The left edge on this side shows a column of what seem 12 arrows pointing inward, but the fourth pictograph on the top clearly differs from the others, right? And I take it to represent a gun instead of an arrow. Immediately to the right of those signs, there is another column consisting from top to bottom of 4 smaller vertical lines, these 4 here. And those represent 4 Comanches wounded, apparently 3 by arrow, these 3, and 1 by gun, this one here, right? Then there are 8 U-shaped signs down here that represent horses that Comanches were mounting and were injured in the action. And then a little farther to inward, or to the right, there is another row of or column of U-shaped signs, but this time rotated kind of 90 degrees, that represent the horses that Comanches captured. A little farther, near the middle of the paper, there is this symbol identified as F, which represents a Comanche warrior that died of the wounds. And finally, oops, sorry. I have to be careful with this mouse. Slightly to the right of the long and thick vertical line labeled as A here, that represents the expedition leader, Isampampi. There is another pictograph consisting of an even longer vertical line here, from which there are 5 kind of horizontal lines interrupted by a circle. And as I will explain later, I take this to represent a scalp pole or lance. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about who the people on this document are and what the document itself represents. So I'm going to be reading a little bit. And if there is anything that I need to clarify, feel free to interrupt me, okay? So in the 18th century, numerous Atapascan-speaking peoples, collectively known as Plains or Eastern Apaches, lived east and northeast of the upper Rio Grande. So Eastern Apaches here, at the time of what this map refers to, have already been pushed south by the Comanches. But originally, this whole region, from the Plate River, at least from the Plate Basin or the Platte Basin to the Canadian and even farther south, was occupied by Apaches. So the whole high plains of Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, and so forth were Apache territory before the Comanches began to migrate there. So having acquired horses, some of those Apaches made a living mainly as nomadic hunter-gatherers. Others, while still foraging, also raised corn, squash, and beans, which required them to live, at least seasonally, in more stable villages to tend their gardens. All Plains Apaches, however, depended on the hunt of big game for their subsistence, competing with one another and with neighboring natives over the natural resources of the plains, as well as European introduced livestock and manufactures that were starting to come from the south, from the Spanish, but also from the east, from the French. Some Apache bands were in the habit of raiding and or trading with certain Pueblo villages and Hispanic settlements in New Mexico. So there was this ambivalent relationship with the Apaches that particular bands would trade at particular villages while remaining at war with others, and vice versa. As Comanches, Utes, and other Indians gradually forced them out of the Bison Range, displaced Apaches intensified their forays on northern New Spain, on the Spanish settlements. We know through other sources that the Atapascans featured in the pictographic document were Pharaon Apaches. Despite their pervasiveness in New Mexico's early documentary record, the Pharaones remain as elusive to scholars as they once were to Spanish soldiers. Apparently, Spaniards first used the word Pharaon, which means literally pharaoh, in allusion to some Apaches living between Pecos Pueblo and El Paso in 1675, because of their paganism and seeming animosity toward Christians, although I'm not 100% sure that this is the case. Beginning in the 1690s, the Pharaones, who apparently roamed as far north as the Canadian River Basin, were allied with the Pecos. The term Pharaon appears to have been utilized as a generic at times. In 1692, for instance, some Pharaones were reported as far west as Acoma Pueblo, which is in western New Mexico. By the early 18th century, however, and I'm going to move to the next, Spaniards generally utilized the ethnonym Pharaon to refer to an Apache division whose territory lay east of New Mexico. So this is an early 18th century map of New Mexico. As you can see, the Spanish only claim pretty much the Rio Grande Basin. And all these Apache groups, actually, let me see if I can make this bigger. So all of these are Apache groups to the east, and you see the name Pharaon several times here. They call them Apaches Pharaones Gentiles, which means heathen Pharaon Apache. Pharaon Apaches here, 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 here. So all over the place, east of the Spanish settlements. Beginning in the 1690s, the Pharaones, who apparently, I already read this. Pharaones launched frequent livestock raids in the Bernalillo area of New Mexico during the governorship of Pedro Rodriguez Cubero. That's around the turn of the 18th century. In the spring of 1704, Governor Diego de Vargas led a campaign against them in the area of the Sandia Mountains. His force consisted of 50 Spanish soldiers, as well as Tewa, Pecos, and Queres auxiliaries. Pharaon spies detected the Spanish and their allies, and the Apaches managed to elude the intruders for a week. Vargas fell ill and died suddenly on April 8th, bringing the campaign to an abrupt end. This is the first major Spanish campaign against the Faraones. In 1715, some Faraones still resided on the banks of the Canadian, east of its confluence with the Mora. Faraon forays in New Mexico continued until the late 1750s, when Governor Tomás Vélez Cachupín reached a temporary truce with them. According to Durango's bishop, Pedro Tamarón y Romeral, who visited the province in 1760, the so far bellicose Utes and Faraones were then at peace in New Mexico because of their fear of the Comanches. Faraones, however, resumed their raids soon thereafter, extending them also to Nueva Vizcaya, or New Biscay, which is the Spanish province that included what we now call Chihuahua, Durango, and parts of Coahuila. So while all Eastern Apaches refer to themselves using some variation of the Atapascan term Nde, which means literally people, we do not know Faraones' self-designation, so we don't know what they call themselves. We have some guesses, though. Spanish sources from 1715 indicate that Faraones called themselves Cejines, a very similar spelling to the Cejene, whom Antonio Cordero identified as Mescaleros several decades later. In the 1770s, however, Commandant Inspector Hugo O'Connor gave the Atapascan name for the Faraones as Selcay Sanende, which seems to incorporate the Mescalero name for the Sierra Blanca, which is literally Silgaizen Ne, which means White Mountain in Atapascan. In 1796, Spanish veteran officer and expert frontiersman Antonio Cordero wrote a thorough description of the Apaches. According to him, the Atapascan name for the Faraones was Itahene, perhaps the Nitahende or Earth Crevice people division of the contemporary Mescaleros. The Faraones sometimes allied with the lower Mimbreño Apaches who lived west of the Rio Grande to raid New Mexico. More often, though, they joined with the Mescaleros and/or the Llanero Apaches. According to Cordero, Comanches had pushed the Faraones southward at the beginning of the century. At the time, they inhabited the mountains of southern New Mexico between the Rio Grande and the Pecos. Only a splinter group of the Faraones had stayed north at the Jicarilla Mountains, where they farmed and traded with the Taos Indians of northeastern New Mexico. These Apaches Jicarillas remained in peace and were allies of the Spanish in that province. But the other Faraones had sought the protection of the southern mountains, from where they used to raid the settlements of New Mexico to the north and New Biscay to the south, collaborating often with the eastern Mescaleros, with whom they apparently were closely connected. So all of these Apache groups, even though independent, sometimes allied with one another to launch raids, or so the Spanish sources say, right? So now we know who the people under attack were, which is these people, right? The Faraon Apaches. Let's look at where the action took place. So interestingly, the encounter represented in our document occurred at the southern edge or at the foothills of the Sierra Blanca, which is this section here. This mountain, which has great historical and cultural value for the Apaches in the region, still remains it's still part of the Mescalero Reservation to this day. So this mountain range, the Sierra Blanca, stretches for about 40 miles from north to south and about 20 miles east to west in southeastern New Mexico. In a predominantly arid region, the Sierra Blanca and the contiguous Sierra del Sacramento, which is much larger to the south, constituted a natural reserve of game, water, and wood. Those mountain ranges laid in the southeastern margin of the province of Salinas, as the Spanish call it, which was once inhabited by Humanos and Tompiros, raised up to about 12,000 feet of altitude. Sierra Blanca Peak, in particular, is the highest topographic prominence in the state. In a sunny day, this formidable mountain is visible from an exceptionally long distance, especially from the Tularosa Basin to the west, but it can also be seen from many other ranges, some as distant as Sandia Crest, about 130 miles to the north or northwest of the Sierra Blanca as the crow flies near Albuquerque. And surprisingly, Sierra Blanca Peak has served as an important landmark throughout history, helping people from diverse cultural traditions to navigate the region. Mescaleros call it Silgaitzani, as I mentioned earlier, which means White Mountain, and Comanches called it Tacatoya, which means Snow Mountain or Ice Mountain. At different moments, various Apache divisions used this range and the adjacent Sacramento Mountains as their main stronghold in southeastern New Mexico. Mescalero Apaches still consider Sierra Blanca Peak one of their 4 sacred mountains. It was also there that woman painted in white gave birth to her 2 children, killer of enemies and son of water, during a tempestuous storm. And these are all 3 important characters in Mescalero's cosmogony. So now let's talk a little bit about the other protagonists of the story, which are the Cuchuntica Comanche, the people living at the time between the Arkansas and the Canadian here. So culturally more homogeneous than the Apaches, the Shoshonian-speaking Comanches were not politically integrated either. Originally from today's Wyoming, Comanches initiated a gradual southward migration across the western Great Plains around the end of the 17th century, probably after becoming acquainted with horses. During the following decades, Comanches, often allied with Utes, waged war on the Apaches and other plains groups. Despite their frequent raids, aimed principally at obtaining equines and occasional periods of open war, Comanches traded regularly in New Mexico since they first turned up there around 1711. The Comanches involved in the 1787 campaign, depicted in the document, belonged to the Cuchuntica division from Comanche Cuchuteca, which means literally bison eater or cow eater. Their territory at the time centered on the high plains between the Arkansas and the Canadian rivers. At the time, Spaniards also recognized another 3 divisions within the Comanche nation, the Hupes or Hupena, which are these folks over here, Hupe meaning timber, so this would be the forest people, so to speak, and the Yamparica, farther north, Yamparica meaning Yampa eaters, Yampa being a tubercle, like an edible root. And a little farther to the southeast, there was a splinter group of the Cuchunticas that the Spanish of New Mexico just called Comanches. Sorry, in Texas, they were just called Comanches, and they used the generic Yamparica for all the others. Whereas in New Mexico, they differentiated between these 3 divisions, and they called the Eastern Comanches just Orientales, which means literally Easterners. So I'm going to gloss over who this guy, the Comanche leader Isampampi, was, in order to not use too much time. And please, someone let me know when I'm running out of time, okay? Just in case, or at least, yeah, let's do that. So Apache and Comanche forays into northern New Spain intensified in the 1770s, partly due to a prolonged drought on the southern plains. Faced with widespread Indian raids, Spanish authorities began a thorough military and administrative reorganization of the northern provinces that culminated in the creation of the General Command of the Interior Provinces in 1776. By then, Comanches controlled much of the central and part of the southern high plains, an area that came to be known as La Comancheria, and pervasive Apache hostilities had become a major concern for Spanish authorities. Over time, many Spaniards came to see most Apaches as untrustworthy due to a perceived lack of commitment to peace treaties and an alliance with the Comanches against the Apaches as the cornerstone of a successful defensive frontier policy. A large New Mexican expedition commanded by Governor Anza attacked the Comanches in the heart of their territory in 1779. In the wake of this military setback, and here we have the original map of the expedition, and here is a reconstruction that was done recently by a scholar. So in the wake of this military setback and the deadly smallpox pandemic of 1780 to 1781, Comanches and Spaniards made peace in Texas in 1785 and in New Mexico in 1786. The Cuchunticas initiated a diplomatic approach to Spanish New Mexico in July of 1785 when a party of them turned up in Taos offering trade and peace. In February of the following year, their main leader, Ecueracapa, which supposedly means the orphan, representing all 3 of the Western divisions, reached an agreement with Governor Anza at Pecos Pueblo. In the following months, 23 band leaders from 3 Western Comanche divisions visited New Mexico to ratify the pact. On October 5, 1786, Jacobo Ugarte y Loyola, the Commandant General of the Western Interior Provinces, sanctioned the treaty, adding just some minor modifications to the agreement. And finally, in April of 1787, Anza met with representatives from all Comanche divisions, someplace in the Comancheria, to close the final agreement. And unfortunately, we haven't found this document yet. We know it exists, but no one has found it. So let's keep our fingers crossed. The Comanche-Spanish treaties of the mid-1780s inaugurated a period of largely peaceful interaction between both peoples, particularly in New Mexico, where the alliance lasted till Comanches entered the reservation in the 1870s. Even though Spaniards would reach several agreements with various Apache divisions in the following decades, they could never make a treaty involving the whole Apache nation, as they did with the Comanches. So, following the treaties, Comanches and Spaniards supported each other militarily, campaigning together sometimes. Initially, Comanche warriors joined a few Spanish expeditions against Apaches on both sides of the Rio Grande, but the inability of the unruly Comanches to adapt to a unified command quickly dissuaded Spaniards from continuing that practice. Most often, Comanche warriors fought the Apaches on their own. Typically, Spaniards supplied them with firearms, powder, and ammunition, which they had to return upon the completion of the campaign. Occasionally, Spanish troops helped the Comanches against distant enemy tribes as well. Isampampi's campaign, the one represented in the document, against the Pharaones must be situated in this context of military actions executed independently by Comanches, but under the auspices and enticements of the Spanish, who were informed, in this case, through the document that we're analyzing here. So, in view of these events, the pictographic report on Isampampi's expedition reveals some interesting patterns. One of the most surprising outcomes of the campaign is the relatively small number of Apaches killed, only 5, these 5 here, right? And horses taken, just 16, vis-a-vis the much larger number of Apaches seized, 35, all these symbols up there. These figures contrast sharply with most Comanche expeditions documented to that date, which typically resulted in the apprehension of many more equines and fewer captives relative to the number of enemies killed and Comanche warriors involved in the action. In the summer of 1786, for instance, Ecuracapa led a massive Comanche expedition against the Apaches, consisting of 347 warriors distributed in 5 parties under their respective leaders. This campaign yielded significantly lower figures than in Isampampi's. Just 85, as many as 85 mounts were taken, but only 2 enemies were captured. So the unusual result of Isampampi's campaign is probably a byproduct of the Comanche-Spanish Treaty of April 1787, whose 7th article stipulated that Spaniards would ransom any Apaches under 14 years of age that Comanches seized, thus encouraging the taking of captives. The relatively low number of enemies killed in both campaigns, 6 in 1786 and 5 in 1787, fits smoothly with Comanche's military ethos, according to which brave acts and plunder were more important than the physical elimination of the adversary. The pictographic representation of the individuals wounded in action also echoes Comanche's emphasis on combat injuries as praiseworthy, being interpreted as the result of an act of courage in which the warrior had risked his life. If our interpretation of the pictographs in the left column as 11 arrows or lances, these ones here, and 1 gun, this one here, right, the 4 from the top, causing injuries to 4 Comanches and 8 Comanche mounts is correct, another interesting pattern emerges. Either Apaches lacked firearms or their use of firearms was remarkably ineffective. Either way, this may have been a crucial factor contributing to giving Comanches the upper hand in their ancestral conflict with the Apache. And here, I'm going to stop for a second to point out that these are the 2 earliest, in this case, pictographic representations by Europeans of Spanish and Comanche, of Apaches and Comanches. I want to point out that Apaches are represented here holding bows and arrows, whereas the Comanches are represented here carrying guns. Given that following the treaties, Spanish routinely supplied Comanches on the warpath with guns, powder, and ammunition, as I pointed out earlier, from the Santa Fe Armory, whereas Pharaones lacked direct access to European firearms and ammunition. Comanches were supposed to return the weaponry and unused ammunition upon the conclusion of each campaign, as I mentioned earlier. Even though the effectiveness of 18th century firearms is often downplayed in scholarly discussions of indigenous warfare, the unprecedented access to such weapons may have given Comanches a significant edge over the Apaches on the battlefield. Throughout the 18th century, Comanches waged an unremitting war on the Eastern Apaches, which, along with pressures from Carowan and Siowan-speaking enemies, resulted in the displacement of the latter from the Central Plains between the Platte and Arkansas rivers. Following the 1786 treaty, Western Comanches stepped up their campaigns against the Eastern Apaches, particularly against the Pharaones, and began to attack other groups farther south and west than ever before. Pharaones were thus caught in a crossfire. Between November 11 and 13, 1789, for instance, a Spanish contingent under Captain Cordero attacked the Pharaones in the Sacramento Range. In the course of 5 skirmishes, Spaniards killed 22 gandules, or young warriors, and 7 women, taking 69 prisoners, including 2 warriors, and captured their horses, dogs, and other property. In May of 1790, some Pharaones descended from the Sierra del Sacramento to El Paso del Norte. So the Pharaones live where this label for mescaleros is. Contemporary scholars have a tendency to use the names of extant groups to refer to past Apache groups, which I think is a mistake, and we can talk about that later in the Q&A. Anyway, so in May of 1790, some Pharaones descended from the mountains to the area of El Paso del Norte in order to negotiate a peace. But they retreated shortly after learning that troops under bellicose Colonel Juan de Ugalde were approaching. And this Juan de Ugalde is the guy after whom the county of Uvalde, as they butchered the name in English, is named, and the town, the sadly famous town of Uvalde. In February of 1791, some Pharaones living in the Robledo Mountains, northwest of El Paso, harassed the area, taking away livestock and a boy. Threatened with Spanish retaliation by some Mescaleros de Paz, or peaceful Mescaleros, they stopped their forays by March. So the Pharaones were under pressure from the Spanish from the south and from the Comanches from the north and the northeast. So the combined offensive of Spaniards and their indigenous allies on the Tabascans led several bands of so-called Apaches de Paz, or peaceful Apaches, to settle at establecimientos, or settlements, near Spanish presidios. Comanche pressure probably triggered the settlement of some Pharaon bands, like the 63 Faraones de Paz, or peaceful Pharaons, reportedly living near San Elizario, that is here. San Elizario was a Spanish presidio that is now part of El Paso. In 1793. On August 27, 1795, however, Cordero informed that 400 Apache warriors, including Pharaones, Mescaleros, and Llaneros, had formed an alliance to attack the border settlements. Spaniards launched another large expedition against the Pharaones in November 1796, and in January 1797, which cost the Apaches another 6 dead and 53 captured, along with 15 horses, whereas only 2 of the soldiers received minor injuries. Around 1810, Commandant General of the Interior Provinces, Nemesio Salcedo, informed that while Spanish troops were campaigning against Apaches in New Mexico, New Biscay, and Sonora, Gileños, Pharaones, and Mescaleros had allied to attack the Hispanic settlements from Sonora to Coahuila. So these wars with the Apaches remained ongoing throughout the Spanish colonial period, but starting in the late 18th century, some Apache bands actually settled peacefully near Spanish settlements, especially near presidios, and ally with the Spanish against other Apaches in some cases. So under constant harassment from Comanches and Spaniards, Pharaones were taken to the brink of extinction. In the early 19th century, several Eastern Apache ethnonyms faded from the documentary record. Most likely, though, survivors from those seemingly vanished peoples amalgamated into the few extant groups whose designations persisted, the people that we still know as Jicarillas, Mescaleros, or Lipans today. The Pharaones gradually waned into oblivion. Nevertheless, considering the Tapascan ethnonyms discussed earlier, the remnants may have been the ancestors of the Mescalero division named Nitahende, known for living in the mountains. So our document is an unusual source, but it's not unique. There is at least another pictographic report from the same period signifying an earlier Comanche campaign against Apaches led by Curacapa in 1786. The existence of at least 2 such documents suggests the transference to paper of a pre-existing genre which Comanches likely practiced on a different medium, rocks, hides, or other perishable material. Such a transference antedates by some 80 years. A similar process occurred starting in the 1860s when Plains Indians of diverse ethnicities began to use ledgers, ink, and pencils to create a characteristic form of narrative and symbolic art that came to be known as ledger art. Following the 1786 treaty, Governor Anza began to supply Comanche leaders with paper to report the outcome of their military expeditions against the Apaches. In January 1788, Commander-in-Chief Jacobo de Ugarte instructed Anza's successor, Fernando de la Concha, to continue that practice, although no additional paper-based pictographic documents have yet surfaced. So these are the only two documents of this kind that we know. Several factors support the interpretation of these campaign reports as a genuine Comanche genre, in which pictographs functioned as mnemotechnic tools to reconstruct a detailed narrative of what happened. First, similar practices are amply documented among indigenous groups throughout the Western Hemisphere, especially in Mesoamerica, where Maya writing reached the highest sophistication by employing glyphs that had both logographic and syllabic value. In that region, the ancient pre-Hispanic pictographic tradition was slowly replaced by a more Western narrative form through the adoption of the Roman alphabet to represent autochthonous languages. Moreover, both pictographic reports are thematically and to some extent iconographically reminiscent of 19th century Plains Indian art, created mostly on ledger books, as I mentioned, but also on clothing, rock panels, etc. The one known to specialists as the biographic tradition, with the important distinction that biographic art represents largely the military deeds of individual warrior artists, whereas Comanche campaign reports reproduce the collective endeavors of an entire war party. Among Plains Indians, the best known examples of the utilization of pictographs as mnemotechnic tools are perhaps calendars and biographic stories. In general, calendars used to consist of a single pictograph per year. Since the natives of the region counted years as winters, their calendars are generally known as winter counts. Even though each pictograph represented iconically a single event, its visualization served the custodian of the calendar, who was also its interpreter and narrator, to remember everything relevant occurred during that year, and thus weave a narrative that might be recited at certain public events. Apparently, only the Kiowas used to represent two events per year, one in the winter and one in the summer, the latter always being a representation of the Sundance, their most important ritual, which they used to hold at the beginning of the summer. Plains Indians biographic stories used to represent acts of courage, especially war deeds, successful hunts, religious ceremonies, mystic visions, or other interactions with the supernatural. Military achievements also became one of the main motifs in the rock art of Plains Indians after the introduction of the horse, giving rise to the peculiar style that we mentioned earlier, the biographic style, right? More importantly, there is ethnographic and archaeological evidence that Comanches used to record the outcome of their raids in rock art panels, tree trunks, large bones, and other media. During an expedition between San Carlos, today's Manuel Benavides in northern Chihuahua, and Monclova Viejo, near today's El Moral in Coahuila, in 1851, Mexican Colonel Emilio Lambert, who was the interim inspector of Chihuahua's military colonies, the Mexican military colonies were kind of these forts that they established following or actually right before the Mexican-American War, in order to protect their border from intruders from the north, right? Both Native Americans and Anglo-Americans. So this guy Lambert, who was inspecting these military colonies, discovered, quote, paintings of the kind that Comanches often make on trees, drawing monkeys, soldiers, and Indians on horse and on foot. He found this at the water hole of La Salada, Coahuila. I've been to several water holes in northern New Mexico, near which rock art reminiscent of the biographic style has been found. He also wrote that, quote, Comanches are very fond of painting. They leave proof of their rustic ability everywhere on the boulders, cliffs, and trees along their way, representing war actions. Lambert's words seem to allude to Plains' biographical style of rock art, which we mentioned earlier, the biographic style, right? Of which there exist several known examples within the Comanches 19th century range in northern Mexico. The layout of the 76 and 1787 documents echoes stylistic patterns and conventions identified in rock panels across the historic Comancheria. That is, the territories historically inhabited by Comanches prior to their confinement in reservations in 1875. and in the larger Comanche raiding and trading hinterlands. And even in other artistic manifestations attributed to Comanches, such as this shirt that you're looking at now. The practice of using small vertical lines organized into rows to count individuals, or U or omega-shaped signs to represent horses, arrow and gun-like symbols to represent shots or weapons or injuries or deaths inflicted by such weapons, and upright or inverted keyhole-shaped signs to represent individuals are all documented in rock art that sometimes antedates the production of the documents discussed here, as well as in more recent ledger art from the 19th century. According to Comanche consultant Nemarui, quote, wives of brave warriors had a special decoration on the tongue or the back of their dresses, one L sign for each war honor in dark blue, end quote. Comanches also used to represent an individual's military honors in painted warrior histories, which were sometimes summarized through a series of strips in the leggings or headdresses, where feathers often accomplished a similar function. Another remarkable similarity with rock art is the utilization of symbols derived from the Plains Sign Language. Let me move on. The pictograph representing the Apache captives reproduce bidimensionally the notion of someone bound at the wrists. Let me make this bigger so that you can tell better. So we're talking about these pictographs up there. So they represent bidimensionally the notion of someone bound at the wrists, the Plains Indian sign for prisoner. They suggest a schematic lateral view of human beings with their elbows flexed and their forearms pointing upward as if their hands were tied, resembling a Christian at prayer, right? And with their heads pointing toward the center of the document in this case. The sign was made closing the hands and crossing the wrists in front of the body, usually the right hand resting on the left with the thumbs up. This interpretation drawing on the Plains Sign Language echoes similar equivalences proposed by other scholars, confirming the great potential that this language has to identify yet undeciphered iconography occurring in rock and other art forms throughout the plains and beyond. Both in Ecuracapa's and in Isampampi's reports, captured enemies are represented by inverted humanoid figures, shaped as keyholes in the earlier document, which suggests a Comanche convention to signify prisoners. Some of the pictographs and their distribution in the 1787 document parallel ethnographic descriptions of the rituals performed where a Comanche party managed to kill enemies and obtain at least one scalp without suffering meaningful casualties. In those cases, upon returning to their camp, the warriors stopped at the outskirts to preen themselves, paint their bodies in blue and the inner side of the scalps in blue or red, and fix them to blue painted poles, utara in Comanche, which means decorated lance or decorated pole. Early in the morning, they entered the camp riding their horses, singing as a victory song, shrieking and shooting their firearms. The leader got ahead of the others, holding one of the poles with the scalps taken from the enemy, which is what this seems to represent. They rode around camp toward the east, where they dismounted and scattered. The scalps were exhibited on poles that evening during the scalp dance, utabneka, which was danced moving forward and backward. In this dance, the wives and other female kin of the warriors were honored. These women dancers wore their warriors' relatives' headdresses, necklaces, and other regalia, and were painted like them. And they also held the poles or lances with the scalps. During the dance, a herald recited the deeds of the warriors aloud, mentioning their fathers and the gifts made by each warrior to redistribute the booty among community members. Sometimes they placed a single pole with the scalp at the center, and men and women formed two rows facing each other and danced by stepping forward and backward. Captives were often forced to partake in the dance, and this might also be a representation of that, with the warriors or the females impersonating the warriors here and the captives on the opposite row. The representation of military deeds and the layout of the pictographs in our document, with the scalp pole in the middle near the symbol signifying the war party leader, and with the warriors and captives in two rows facing each other, evoke the triumphal parade of the victorious warriors and the scalp dance. Lastly, It is also noteworthy that the Comanches and their horses wounded in battle featured prominently in the composition, echoing the Comanche practices of honoring battle injuries as military deeds and personifying war horses. So, in conclusion, rather than a map, as suggested by the Library of Congress catalog, Isampampi's report is a tally to recount the outcome of Isampampi's Cuchuntica Comanche expedition against the Faraón Apaches in the Sierra Blanca in July of 1787. Rather than being a unique artifact inspired by the Spanish, our document most likely belongs to a genuinely Comanche genre traditionally used to communicate the outcome of military expeditions and announce the deeds of the warriors to the community, conforming to the Comanche military ethos. Only 2 documents of this kind have surfaced so far, both made in the 1780s, which represent the earliest example of the transference to paper of themes, iconographies, and styles amply documented among Plains Indians in rock art dating from both before and after that decade, as well as in the ledger art of the second half of the 19th century, characterized by the use of pictographs with a mnemotechnic function. Despite the relatively humble results of most Comanche attacks on the Apaches in the late 18th century, our document illustrates the expanding raiding hinterland of the Western Comanches following the Anzai-Curacapa Treaty of 1786. It also suggests a shift in Comanche military goals, at least temporarily, from the traditional emphasis on taking horses to seizing captives, probably in response to the Spaniards' declared willingness to ransom young Apaches as stipulated in the April 1787 treaty. It also suggests the inefficiency of Apache firearms, or lack thereof, in contrast with the better supplied Comanches, who likely benefited from this tactical advantage to at least temporarily force them, the once powerful Faraones, out of their traditional mountain bastions in southeastern New Mexico and into a settlement in the vicinity of Presidio de San Elizario. Lastly, the 1780s pictographic campaign reports represent a distinct Comanche genre and constitute an important precedent to the biographic tradition that they antedate by several decades. One last corollary of our discussion is that given the lack of documents written by natives, scholars interested in interethnic relations along the northern frontier of New Spain and in other indigenous frontiers, for that matter, may benefit substantially from considering non-traditional sources, including pictographic documents like the ones I have discussed, rock art and ethnographic, archaeological, and linguistic evidence. Analyzing those sources from an ethnohistorical and multidisciplinary perspective, as I have tried to do here, offers an opportunity to get closer to indigenous experiences, perceptions, and perspectives in ways that will remain precluded if we rely exclusively on documents produced by Europeans. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Joaquin. We do have one question in the chat already from Scott. How did captive taking by Comanches change from the late 1700s to the mid 1800s? Did it offer other native did it differ among other native peoples such as the Apache and Hispanic and American peoples?
So to make sure I understand the question, the last part of the question has to do with whether they treated differently different captives?
Yes, I think that's what it's asking.
Okay, so first of all, we have much more information as far as captives are concerned, and in general, we have much more information about the 19th century than we do about the 18th, right? So chances are that because of this imbalance, we may not have, I mean, whatever comparison I make may not be, necessarily accurate. The most significant distinction that we can be certain about is that whereas in the 18th century, the majority of Comanche captives or of the captives taken by Comanches were other indigenous people, by the second decade of the 19th century, the majority of the captives taken by Comanches are Hispanics on both sides of the Rio Grande. And this pattern continues into the 1850s. Seemingly, I wouldn't say that Comanches were color blind or race blind, because they actually labeled people using kind of references to their phenotype quite often. But I haven't been able to establish any different patterns in the way they treated their captives based on their, let's say, geographic or ethnic origin. With one caveat, though, that by the mid-19th century, at least some Comanche bands systematically killed whites and wouldn't take even sometimes, let's say, Anglo-American children prisoners, because they could be easily recognized by the Indian agents or the traders, whereas the Hispanics were not so easily told apart from the Indians, right? So that's the only nuance in terms of how different people were treated. Did this answer your question, Scott?
He says yes.
Okay.
And then while I was reading Scott's question, I thought I saw a hand raise. Was that you, Scott, or was that somebody else?
Can't get this thing to.
That was someone else.
Okay. Well, whoever had a question, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah,
I'd like to ask, so you think that these depictions, the almost ledger art, was done by the Comanches, and then of course the legend was added by a Spanish speaker. Is that basically what you think?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the pictographs.
Yes. Well, this paper that you said.
Yeah. The document that I was showing you from the beginning. Yeah.
Right. It's
so the pictographs in that document, the upper section,
right,
is Comanche made, but clearly the lower part is written by a European hand.
Exactly. Yeah, extremely interesting. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's fascinating, the document.
I have a question. This is Chris Lentz calling. Basically, the map that you show of the by Mira y Cadillo, is that correct?
Which
Can
one?
you go back to that image of the two early paintings?
Let me share the screen again. Sure.
The 1760 map.
Yeah, I'm trying to share. Give me just a second.
I appreciate you going and trying to find it.
Can you see it now?
I don't. All I see is your map.
Yeah, but
oh, here we go. Here we go. I've got the whole.
Is it this one?
Yeah. Well, this will do. This is, yes, that's it. What I'm most fascinated by is that the upper left side picture indicates that we've got both straight bows and recurve bows being used simultaneously. Have you?
Yeah, here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one problem with these early, representations of Native Americans on European maps is that they were not necessarily accurate, right? I mean, you can just see that the hairdresses of the Apache and the Comanche are kind of very similar, and they're just conventional.
Okay.
But I think it's remarkable that in the case of the Apaches, they are not carrying any weapons, any firearms, whereas in the case of the Comanches, they are. So they are also, I mean, this guy is also holding what seems like a hatchet, like with a metallic hatchet hanging from his wrist, right?
Right.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, these two bows look different, but it may just be, an artistic,
It might be, but the rock art sites that I'm finding up near Amarillo have got both kinds of bows depicted on one of the sites.
Nice.
Both varieties, and I find that to be fascinating. The other thing is that you claim that the rifles are more effective than the bows, but I think if you were to do search on YouTube, you'd find that there's a YouTube of a guy shooting a bow and arrows in the air, and I think he releases 12 arrows before the first one comes back and hits the ground. And yet, when you've got a rifle like that, if you got to use powder horns and all kinds of other details, you can't possibly fire off more than, it takes a minute or two to reload the rifle. And
I agree. I agree. I didn't say that the firearms were more efficient. I said that they are often downplayed, and they may have been more efficient in different ways, not necessarily, because
okay.
you can kill more people in a shorter period of time. But otherwise, how would you explain that everyone wanted to have firearms, including the Apaches?
Well, my recollection is that when Major Long went down the Canadian River and ran into the Kiowas for the first time, they set up a little powwow event where Long was passing out beads and everything to the people. And he gave a pistol to the chief of the Kiowa that were in attendance. And the Kiowa looked at it and gave it back to him and said, "I'd rather have a knife. I can't use this once, the firearms run out." So, it may be a status symbol at some point in time, but initially, firearms were pretty much worthless to.
But you see, I wouldn't say they were worthless. That's a widespread. No, seriously, there is a widespread opinion among academics that firearms were useless. And I'm going to. I mean, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'm going to share with you a book that was published a few years ago that argues otherwise. And one of the case studies that this author discusses is actually the planes. So I think he makes a compelling argument that we shouldn't underestimate the value of arms or firearms in military context, even among indigenous people.
Well, I'm not going to argue that too much because I also see firearms being smashed and broken up into pieces and converted to things like fleshing tools, where they'll take the barrel and smash it and make a hide flesher out of it.
Right.
So these are exotic kinds of things that are maybe status symbols for certain people, but in terms of fighting, they may not be all that useful.
Yeah,
but guns are also useful early on as for their shock value, as well as status symbols and things.
Good point, Scott.
Yeah, there are lots of theories about why firearms were appealing. I mean, there is a whole. I don't remember again the reference, the name of the author, but there is a whole article about why not just firearms but metallic tools in general, but specifically firearms, were considered Manitou by the Algonquians, and it's kind of more of a almost of a mystic value rather than pragmatic,
Sure.
But if you read the documents of the Spanish and the French in the 18th century, they systematically emphasize why certain groups had the upper hand over others. Like, for instance, why the Osage ended up becoming the main power on the Central Plains, and they attributed to the not just to their ability to use firearms, but also their access to powder and ammunition, right? Which the others didn't.
Exactly.
And also, some of the people who obtained guns early on obtained them through intermediaries, right? So also occupying an intermediary position in those networks could be, strategically significant, right?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Let's see.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much, Joaquin.
All right.
That was a fantastic presentation. We're so happy you came to speak with us tonight.
Well,
hey, Aaron, I had one more question in the chat.
Of course.
Oh,
sorry.
Did I miss one?
Just popped up.
Is the Spanish law forbid trading ammo to the native people of your research suggests this may not have always been that was one. Yeah, you're right. So yeah, the Spanish made a policy not to deal firearms or alcoholic beverages to the natives, but that changes in the 1770s. In the 1770s, with this reorganization of everything, they allow the sales of weapons occasionally. And actually, they use firearms as gifts. for Native Americans quite often, firearms and ammunition. And in the case of New Mexico, we know that they actually shared their weaponry with campaigning Comanches who stopped on their way against the Apaches at Santa Fe to get their guns, and then they would return them on the way back. That's kind of unique, though. I haven't seen that happening in Texas, for instance.
Well, doesn't that coincide kind of like the sacking of San Saba when the Spanish went up to the longest site in Oklahoma? And at that time, as I recall, the Wichita Village was a fortified site on the north side of the Red River. Of course, the Spanish lost a cannon in that little skirmish that happened at the time, but there was a resident French blacksmith living in that camp at the time.
Yeah,
as I
so
recall.
that was in the late 1750s. This is
Yes.
like about 30 years later.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think it's it's interesting that, of course, the Red River was the boundary of where Texas kind of stopped, and these were the French that were on the north side of the river.
Well, Spanish Texas was much farther south, actually. So San Saba, the mission itself was beyond the Spanish settlements. It was kind of an outpost, right?
Yeah.
And very
Menard.
temporary, also.
It's out at Menard.
Yeah, Menard, which is still Central Texas nowadays. Yeah.
Of course, originally the Spanish holdings went all the way up to Wyoming.
Yeah. But if you look at Spanish maps, it's interesting because when you look at, the maps our children are taught in school, they paint the continent like half blue, half red, and this is the French, this is the Spanish, and this is the English, right? But if you look at the Spanish, especially the Spanish and the French maps, they actually recognize the occupation of the land by natives everywhere. Like the map I showed you earlier, like this map. This is Spanish New Mexico. You see the boundary here? It's not the whole of New Mexico as we think of nowadays.
Right.
And the rest is occupied by people which are actually, or who are actually identified by the respective designation, right? Including the different Apache groups, like the Carlanes, the Jicarillas, the Faraones, and so forth. Any other questions?
No.
Or are we ready for dinner now?
Sorry about that. I had to
Thank
go
you,
get my
Joaquin.
dog some water, but thank you so much, Joaquin.
No problem. My pleasure.
And
Excellent presentation, Joaquin.
Exactly.
Thank you. So I'll be relying on the wisdom of some of you in the near future, probably. All right. Take care, everyone.
Okay. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
hey, are we all ready to start our business meeting?
Sure.
Yeah, thumbs up. Okay, cool. I'm not hearing any objections, so. All right, motion to approve January minutes. Okay, Veronica and Paul, and then all in favor? All opposed? All right, the motion passes. We do publications report first. Yeah, I've done this so many times, but I can't remember. Is it publications first? Okay. Where is Andy? Was he on?
He was.
Oh,